Growing up in Talladega, Alabama back in the 1950s, I had the feeling that I lived in a safe world. A world created in large part by my parents and people like them. People who loved me, people who were dependable, and people who were in charge. If anything got broken in my world, I had the feeling that my daddy could fix it, or knew somebody who could. If I got hurt in my world, I could always climb up in my mama's lap, and she could make me feel better. Or if she needed to, she could call Dr. Toole, and he'd come and help her make me feel better. Thinking back on that world, it seems to me it was sort of like a small triangle. At one corner of that triangle was our house down at the end of Cedar Street. 5 of us lived there, my mama and daddy, my 2 older sisters, Alice and Patsy, and me. And living in that house, I woke up every morning knowing that my daddy had already been awake in that world a couple of hours to make sure everything was okay, and he had gone off to work. And I knew he'd be home at 5 minutes after 5 in the afternoon. The second corner of my world was Graham Elementary School, just up Cedar Street from our house about 3 blocks. As my world grew larger, and I went off to elementary school, I had to learn some more rules about how to get along in my world. I remember one day on the playground in the 1st grade, there was a little girl there that just needed pushing down. So I pushed her down. When we got back into the classroom, our teacher, Miss Heath, she called me and that little girl up to the front of the room. She gave that little girl her paddle and told her she could hit me with it. I did not like that. So I learned a lesson that day. No matter how much they need it, you just don't push little girls down. I learned about raising my hand when I wanted to speak. I learned about doing my homework. I learned the rules quickly for living in my triangle as it grew larger. The 3rd corner of my triangle I think of as my Grandmama Jimmy's apartment. My Grandmama Jimmy used to teach Sunday school at First Methodist Church. She taught the children of that church for years and years and years, but one time a new young minister came to that church, and he thought maybe they could attract more young families if they had a younger person teaching their children Sunday school, and so he asked my Grandmama Jimmy if she would mind taking a year off. She didn't just take a year off. She took her flannel board and walked out of that church. And she never went back except to the funerals of her friends. But that didn't mean she stopped teaching with that flannel board. She just started teaching me. I'd go over to her apartment. Oh, it smelled like a combination of lilacs and yogurt. My Grandmama Jimmy made her very own yogurt in that apartment. And she'd teach me all about God. And so I began to understand that I lived in a safe world, a dependable world where my daddy could fix almost anything that got broken, and my mama could make me feel better if I got hurt, and looking over everything was a God who would reward you if you were good and punish you if you were bad. Now I knew there was a larger world out there. I knew this because our family took National Geographic. And my daddy believed it was wrong to ever throw away a copy of National Geographic. So the whole bottom shelf of our bookshelf was yellow with National Geographics. And sometimes when it would rain, I would sit down on the floor there and just pull out old issues. And I would see pictures of the larger world where people didn't live just the way we did. I saw that there were places, for instance, where women went around without their shirts on, and where men went around with bones dangling from their noses. I also knew it was a larger world out there because right on the edge of my triangle was the Martin movie theater. They got a new movie every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Another new movie ran every Thursday and Friday, and on Saturday there was a double feature. And I loved to go sit in the dark and watch those movies. I knew about Africa because I went to Tarzan movies. And I knew about the Wild West with the Indians and the bad guys because I went to Roy Rogers movies and John Wayne movies. But oh, my favorite movies of all were the Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis movies. Twice a year they came out with a new movie, and in the weeks before those movies came to town, those weeks were like Christmas to me. I just couldn't wait. Jerry Lewis became my idol, my hero. Thinking back on it, it's amazing to me that my father never said anything about my choice of heroes, because Jerry Lewis was about as different from my daddy as you could possibly get without actually hanging from a tree by your tail. In the summer of 1956, the news came out in the newspaper that Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis had split up forever. It was like a death in our family to me. I imagined that if my daddy would just get on a plane and fly out to Hollywood, he could fix that broken relationship. But I never asked him to do that because I knew he would say no. 2 years later, in the summer of 1958, my daddy announced that finally I was old enough for our family to take a long car trip all the way from Talladega, Alabama, out to La Jolla, California, where Aunt Mary lived, my favorite aunt and my dad's sister. It sounded like we were going to another world, a place where they didn't even pronounce the letter J the way we did. Now, my sister Alice was not going with us because the summer before she'd gotten married. She lived over in Marietta, Georgia, and she was busy having the first grandchild in our family. My mama actually went over and stayed with her to help her have that grandbaby, so Mama couldn't help us get ready for the trip. Patsy wasn't much help either. She was going with us, but she wasn't real happy about it because it was going to be time away from all of her boyfriends. So she was making up for that lost time by spending all the time she could with her boyfriends. That meant it was up to my daddy and me to plan the trip. Now, our family did not belong to AAA. You didn't need AAA to get around in Talladega County. But my Aunt Mary belonged to AAA, and she had them send us maps of our whole trip with little books called triptychs where you could turn the pages and read all about what you were supposed to see in that part of the trip. We were going to drive across Texas, and we were going to see Carlsbad Caverns and the Painted Desert and the Petrified Forest and the Grand Canyon, and we were going to go to Las Vegas, Nevada. And then when we got to California, Aunt Mary was going to take us to Yosemite National Park and San Francisco and Hollywood and Disneyland. And more than anything else, I said to my daddy, I hope we see Jerry Lewis. My daddy did not look or sound very hopeful about that. My daddy had air conditioning put on our car. He wouldn't have done something like that just to make us comfortable. My daddy didn't spend a lot of money just to make us comfortable. But he had heard about driving across the desert in the summertime. He had heard that it got so hot in the daytime you could die. And you didn't want to do it at night because that's when all the rattlesnakes came out and laid on the road to stay warm. So he got air conditioning put on our car to save our lives. And he said, let's not tell your mama about this. Let's surprise her. Now, we were sort of worried about my sister having that baby on time so we could leave when we were planning to. And she did. And we went over to Georgia to see that baby, and we brought my mama home. And my mama washed all her clothes and got packed, and one early morning in July, we got up at 4:30. We fixed a big breakfast and ate it. We washed the dishes and put them away, and then we got in the car and started out for California. We were heading down the Sylacauga Highway before the sun even came up. My daddy got that car up to 45 miles an hour, and the speed governor started to buzz. This was one of those cars that had a speed governor on it. You could set at any speed you wanted to. When you reached that speed, it would start to buzz. He had it set about 70, but it was buzzing at 45. He ran it all the way up as high as it would go, about 120. It was still buzzing at 45 miles an hour. It was broken. We were either going to have to drive to California at less than 45 miles an hour or listen to that speed governor buzz all the way out there or turn around and get it fixed. And the problem was, no service stations were open yet. That wasn't a real problem, though, because my daddy knew where the mechanic lived. We pulled up in the mechanic's driveway. He came out in his bathrobe with a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. He raised our hood, put that cup of coffee down on the fender. He leaned over under the hood for about 30 seconds, and then he came out, said, "I disconnected it. You're ready to go." My daddy said, "How much do we owe you?" He said, "Oh, you don't owe me anything, Mr. George. You all just have a nice time." And we started out again. That morning, about 10 o'clock, I guess, my daddy said, "It's starting to get kind of warm in this car." He said to my mother, "Sugar, raise your window." She said, "Why would I raise my window if it's getting warm in here?" And he reached over and turned on the air conditioner. Oh, my mama was so surprised. In the next 15 minutes, we learned that shotgun was the cold spot. My mama asked my daddy to pull over so she could get a sweater out of the trunk. It was one of those air conditioners that you could run for about 50 minutes, and then about 10 minutes every hour you had to turn it off so the condenser wouldn't freeze up. We went to Austin, Texas, where my daddy's Army buddy, Colonel Scott, lived on a real ranch. It was way out in the country, and the roads kept getting narrower and dustier, and we finally pulled into his ranch, and it looked just like Roy Rogers' Double R Bar Ranch in the movies. I couldn't wait to get out and run off some of my energy, playing cowboys and Indians on their ranch. Colonel Scott and his wife said, "Oh, have a good time. Just listen out for rattlesnakes." I played cowboys and Indians for a little while, but pretty soon I came back in the house where it was safe. We stayed there a couple of days. One of the days we were sitting down in their living room talking, and they asked us what we were going to see on our trip. And I said, "Oh, we're going to Carlsbad Caverns. We're going to see the Painted Desert and the Petrified Forest and the Grand Canyon and Hoover Dam. And once we get to California, we're going to Yosemite National Park and San Francisco and Hollywood and Disneyland. And more than anything else, I hope to see Jerry Lewis." Colonel Scott's wife got this funny look on her face, and she said, "Jerry Lewis? Oh, I can't stand Jerry Lewis." I couldn't believe she said that, and I also couldn't believe my mama just sat there and didn't say, "Oh, if you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all," which is what she would have said to me if I'd said something like that. But my mama just sat there with a look on her face like, "I didn't hear anything." We left Colonel Scott's and we drove all across West Texas, and we got to Carlsbad Caverns. And that night we sat up at the entrance to the caverns while a ranger told us the bats were going to fly out in 10 minutes. And then he said they're going to start in 5 minutes. And then he started counting down the seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And just at that point you could hear them down in the cave, and they started flying out, and millions of bats filled up the sky. The next morning, we had signed up for the grand tour of Carlsbad Caverns, not the short tour that you take an elevator down to the bottom, but the grand long tour where you actually walked in the entrance of the caverns. We started down the entrance to the caverns, and my mama stopped. She said, I can't go on. My daddy said, oh, sugar, come on. Once you get past this part, it'll be like a big old football stadium. You won't feel claustrophobic. But my mama said, I can't go. And she turned around and she walked out of that cavern. She said, I'm going to go up to the gift shop and read. I'll meet you there when you finish. Have a good time. We went on down into the caverns, and at one point they asked us to all sit down on some benches they'd carved out of the rocks down there and not to move, and they turned the lights off. And it got so dark you could feel it in the pit of your stomach. You could wave your fingers right in front of your eyes and not see a thing. I learned 2 things that day. I learned just how dark it could get in this world, and I learned that there was something in this world that scared my mama so bad she couldn't go on, and my daddy couldn't fix it. We went from there on through the painted desert and the petrified forest, and we came to the Grand Canyon. My daddy went into Bright Angel Lodge to get our keys to our cabin we'd reserved, and I stood outside and watched real live Indians, dressed all in feathers. One of them was beating a drum and the other one was doing a dance. It was amazing. My daddy came out of Bright Angel Lodge with a big, thick newspaper under his arm. We went to our cabin and sort of got settled in, and I started looking through that newspaper. It was a Los Angeles Times. I went to my favorite part of it, the page where they show the movies. It wasn't just a page, though, in the Los Angeles Times. There were 4 pages of movie advertisements. I couldn't believe it. But what I really couldn't believe was down in the corner of one of those pages was a picture of Jerry Lewis. And it said live at the Greek Theater, and it gave the dates. And I said, oh, look at this, and I showed it to my parents. And my mama looked at it and she said to my daddy, George, that's 2 days after we leave to come home. Oh, I said, please, can't we stay? And my mama looked at me and said, we'll see. Then we went out to look at the Grand Canyon. I went up to this little rock ledge right at the edge of the top of the canyon, and I could see all the way across 10 miles to the other side, and all the way to the bottom, a whole mile down, I could see the Colorado River, and I said to my daddy, look, there's the Colorado River. And I turned around, and my daddy wasn't standing beside me. He was about 10 feet back. And I said, you can't see it from back there. Come up here and look. But he wouldn't come up any closer. My mama said, oh, he won't get near the edge of anything high up. He's scared of that. I learned 2 things that day. I learned that there was a chance I might get to see my hero, Jerry Lewis. And I also learned that there was something in the world that scared my daddy so much he wouldn't get close to it. We went from there to see Hoover Dam, and then we went to Las Vegas, Nevada. When we got to Las Vegas, Nevada, my sister Patsy had kind of a hard time because in all the hotels in Las Vegas, even though she was 19 years old and I was 13 years old, she was the same age I was, too young to go on the gambling floor. Oh, it made her so mad to have to stay over in the kiddie section with me. She was so mad, in fact, she did something she probably shouldn't have done. She got her wallet out of her purse, she got her driver's license out of it, and she showed it to my daddy. She said, look, it says I'm 21. Oh, my daddy got mad at my sister. She had changed her birth date on her driver's license. The next day, we drove from Las Vegas all the way to La Jolla, California, to my Aunt Mary's house. When we got there, we were just taking the suitcases out of the back of the Buick when my Aunt Mary said, I wish you could have gotten here 2 days ago. If you'd gotten here then, I could have arranged a date for Patsy with Patrick Wayne, John Wayne's son. My sister Patsy was having kind of a hard time on this trip. Well, just like she'd promised, my Aunt Mary took us to Yosemite National Park. We actually drove our Buick through a tree. And then we went to San Francisco and Fisherman's Wharf. And then we went to Hollywood and took the tour of the stars' homes. And then we went to Disneyland, where Big Musketeer Roy from the Mickey Mouse Club was drawing pictures of Mickey Mouse and signing them with his name and our name on them. When we got back to my Aunt Mary's house in La Jolla, she was going through the mail that had come while we'd been on our trip, and she said to my parents, "They're here." And my parents opened up an envelope, and inside there were 3 tickets to Jerry Lewis at the Greek Theater. Oh, I was so excited. My mama and Aunt Mary and I got on the train in La Jolla, and we rode it all the way back up to Los Angeles, and we drove to the Greek Theater. It was a big amphitheater. Outdoors, there was a shell. The parking lot was behind the shell, so you walked in right beside the stage, and in front of you were 4,000 seats on the hillside rising around the shell. We were on the 11th row. And my hero, Jerry Lewis, came out, and he entertained us for 2 hours. He was so funny, and he sang songs, and I sat there just taking it all in. When he finished, he ran off the stage, and some of the people way back up at the back, at the top of the seats, must have thought there was going to be a lot of traffic getting out, and so they started down the steps toward the stage to leave early. Jerry Lewis came back on the stage to take another bow, and he saw these people leaving, and he got furious. He started yelling at them. There was one woman in a red dress he could see in the light. He said, "Lady in the red dress, sit down!" And she plopped down right on the steps. And he sang his encore, and he left for good. I learned 2 things that day. I learned sometimes your dreams come true and you get to see your hero. And I also learned that when you see your hero, sometimes you discover they're just human too. It seemed like driving out to California took forever. It seemed like driving into another world to me. But when we went home, we just drove straight home as fast as we could. And we got home in just over 3 days. When I was carrying my suitcase from the car back into our house, I was thinking about that trip, and I realized I'd learned 2 things on that trip. I'd learned that the world was a lot bigger than I ever thought it was. And there were things in it that scared my mama and daddy so much they couldn't fix them. But I also learned that if you just go 3 days down the Sylacauga Highway, there's Disneyland.